The strange thing about dignity is that the people who have the least of everything usually protect it the most. Rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago as black SUVs lined the entrance of the Grand Emerson Hotel, their headlights glowing against the wet pavement like silent spotlights. Inside, billionaires, investors, and reporters filled a ballroom worth more than most people's homes, all waiting for Ethan Caldwell to finalize the $20 million merger that would dominate the headlines by morning. At 38 years old, Ethan had become one of the youngest tech billionaires in America, a man financial magazines called ruthless, brilliant, and emotionally untouchable. He walked through the marble lobby without looking at anyone, his charcoal suit perfectly pressed, his expression colder than the February wind outside. Employees straightened the moment he passed them. Investors laughed louder when he entered the room. People wanted his approval almost as much as they feared his silence. But just before Ethan reached the private elevator, a sudden commotion near the hotel entrance pulled everyone's attention away from him. A security guard was escorting a woman and a little girl back toward the ring. "You can't stay here," the guard snapped impatiently. "Guests are complaining." The woman looked exhausted, her light brown coat damp from the storm, one hand protecting the small child beside her while the other gripped an old backpack. She couldn't have been older than 32, but hardship had carved shadows beneath her eyes that made her seem older. The little girl beside her held a worn stuffed rabbit under one arm and stared silently at the shining chandeliers above them like she was looking into another universe. "Please," the woman said quietly. "We were only trying to warm up for 5 minutes." "Not my problem," the guard replied. Several guests turned away awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Others watched openly, grateful that the humiliation belonged to someone else. Ethan barely slowed his pace. He had seen scenes like this his entire life. Desperate people asking for sympathy. Strangers hoping guilt would open wallets. In his experience, everyone wanted something. And the moment money entered the room, principles disappeared. But then the little girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "it's okay. We can go." The woman forced a tired smile before kneeling beside her daughter. "No matter what happens," she told her softly, "we still say thank you. Life gets hard sometimes, but we don't let it make us cruel." Something about the way she said it made Ethan stop walking. Not because she sounded dramatic. Not because she was begging. It was the opposite. She spoke with a calm dignity that felt completely out of place in a lobby filled with wealth. Ethan slowly turned around. The room fell strangely quiet as he walked back toward the entrance. Even the security guard stepped aside the moment he recognized him. The woman looked up cautiously, clearly unaware of who he was. Ethan studied her face for a moment, then glanced at the child holding the stuffed rabbit with both hands now. Finally, he spoke. "Let me ask you something." The woman stood silently as rainwater dripped from the edge of her sleeve onto the marble floor. Ethan slid one hand into his pocket and looked directly into her eyes. "If someone offered you enough money to completely change your life," he said, "but accepting it would hurt thousands of innocent people, would you still take it?" The lobby went silent. The investors nearby exchanged confused looks. The security guard frowned. But the woman didn't answer immediately. She simply looked down at her daughter first. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so calm that it unsettled him more than anger ever could. "If my daughter has to watch me destroy other people just so we can survive," she said softly, "then I've already made her poor." And in that single moment, something inside Ethan Caldwell cracked. For several seconds, Ethan Caldwell could not move. The lobby noise slowly returned around him, but the woman's words stayed trapped in his mind like an echo he could not silence. Investors resumed talking. Hotel staff pretended nothing unusual had happened. Somewhere behind him, glasses clinked and elevator doors opened. Yet Ethan remained, standing there, staring at Sarah Mitchell as if she had said something impossible. Most people tried to impress him. Others feared him. Some begged him. But very few ever answered him honestly, especially when survival was involved. Sarah adjusted the strap of her backpack and gently took her daughter's hand again. "Come on, Lily," she whispered softly. "We should go." Ethan watched the little girl nod obediently, her small sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. The child could not have been older than 7. Her cheeks were pink from the cold outside, but she still managed to smile politely at the security guard before leaving. That bothered Ethan more than it should have. Because he knew wealthy adults with far less grace than that little girl standing in soaked shoes. Wait. The word left Ethan's mouth before he fully thought about it. Sarah paused carefully, but did not step closer. Ethan noticed that immediately. She was cautious around rich men, around powerful men. Like experience had taught her not to trust kindness that arrived too suddenly. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "There is a diner 2 blocks from here," he said. "Open all night. Tell them Ethan Caldwell sent you. They will give you dinner." Sarah looked at the card but did not grab it right away. "Why?" she asked quietly. Ethan almost laughed at the question because nobody ever asked him that. People usually accepted whatever he offered without hesitation. Access to him alone could change lives. Yet this woman looked at him like she was weighing the hidden cost of every word. "Because your daughter is freezing," Ethan answered. Sarah hesitated for another moment before finally taking the card. "Thank you," she said softly. Then she added something that surprised him even more. "But I still meant what I said." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She had no idea that her answer had just collided directly with the biggest decision of his career. Upstairs, investors were waiting for him to finalize a $20 million acquisition with Kane Biotech, a pharmaceutical corporation that promised massive returns for everyone involved. The media was already calling it the deal of the year. Financial analysts predicted Ethan's net worth would jump by nearly $300 million within 6 months. But hidden inside the agreement was something almost nobody outside the company knew. Massive layoffs, small-town clinic closures, drug price increases that would quietly destroy thousands of working families already struggling to survive. Ethan knew all of it. And until tonight, he had convinced himself it was simply business. That was how the world worked. Somebody always lost. Somebody always suffered. The strong survived while everyone else adapted or disappeared. That belief had built his empire. It had also made him one of the most feared men in corporate America. As Sarah and Lily walked back toward the storm outside, Ethan suddenly remembered another rainy night almost 25 years earlier. He had been 12 years old, standing beside his exhausted mother inside a grocery store while she counted coins at the register. The cashier had rolled her eyes impatiently. People behind them sighed loudly. Ethan still remembered the humiliation burning in his face when a man behind them offered his mother money. But his mother refused it. Not because they did not need it. They desperately did. She refused because the man expected something in return. "We do not survive by selling pieces of ourselves," she told Ethan later that night. He had spent years convincing himself she was naive. Weak. Poor people said things like that because they had no power. But now, standing inside one of the most expensive hotels in Chicago, Ethan realized something deeply uncomfortable. Sarah Mitchell had just said almost the exact same thing. And for the first time in years, Ethan was no longer completely sure his mother had been wrong. By the time Ethan entered the executive conference room on the 32nd floor, the atmosphere had already shifted. The investors were impatient. Lawyers sat with folders spread across the polished oak table. Large digital screens displayed financial projections glowing in cold blue numbers across the walls. Everything about the room screamed certainty, power, and money. Normally, Ethan thrived in rooms like this. He controlled them. But tonight, his mind kept drifting back to a homeless woman standing in wet shoes beside a little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. "You are late," Victor Kane said sharply from across the table. Victor was in his early 50s, silver-haired, polished, and perfectly rehearsed in every public appearance. He smiled often, but none of his smiles ever reached his eyes. Reporters are already downstairs waiting for the announcement. Ethan took his seat without answering immediately. One of the attorneys slid the final acquisition contract toward him. All that remained was his signature. $20 million. Thousands of future layoffs hidden beneath technical language and legal wording ordinary people would never fully understand. Victor leaned back confidently. "By this time next quarter," he said, "we will control almost 40% of the Midwest pharmaceutical distribution market." Ethan nodded absently while flipping through the pages. Then his eyes stopped on a single line regarding clinic restructuring. The wording sounded harmless. Operational optimization, resource consolidation, corporate phrases designed to soften ugly truths. But Ethan knew exactly what it meant. Rural health centers would close. Prescription costs would rise. Families already drowning in medical debt would lose access to affordable treatment. And somehow, for the first time, the numbers no longer looked abstract to him. They looked personal. Victor noticed his hesitation immediately. "Do not tell me you are getting sentimental now," he said with a dry laugh. Several executives chuckled nervously around the table. Ethan closed the folder slowly. "How many clinics are expected to shut down?" he asked calmly. The room became still. Victor exchanged a glance with one of the analysts before answering. "Approximately 12 underperforming locations over 18 months. And the layoffs?" Ethan continued. "Estimated 600 positions initially." Another executive replied carefully. Ethan leaned back in silence. 600 jobs. 12 clinics. To everyone else in the room, those were acceptable losses attached to profit margins and quarterly growth charts. But suddenly Ethan pictured Sarah standing outside in the freezing rain with Lily beside her, trying to survive one more night without losing her dignity. He hated that image because it unsettled something he had spent years burying. Weakness, compassion, doubt. Victor folded his hands together. "This is how business works, Ethan," he said firmly. "People at the top make hard decisions, so companies survive." Ethan almost agreed automatically. That sentence had shaped most of his adult life. But then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. His mother sitting at a tiny kitchen table years ago, exhausted after working 2 jobs, telling him something he had mocked for years afterward. "Success means nothing if people have to suffer, so you can feel powerful." Back then, Ethan believed she was simply speaking like someone who had failed financially. Now he was no longer certain. Victor tapped the contract impatiently. "Sign the papers," he said. "Tomorrow morning, every major network in America will be talking about you." Ethan stared at the pen lying beside the folder. Usually moments like this excited him. Winning always did. But tonight something felt deeply wrong. Down below, beyond the expensive glass walls of the skyscraper, snow mixed with freezing rain across the streets of Chicago, while people like Sarah searched for somewhere warm enough to sleep. Ethan suddenly wondered how many of those people had been destroyed by decisions made inside rooms exactly like this one. Then his assistant quietly entered the conference room, carrying a tablet. "Sorry to interrupt," she said carefully. "There is something you should probably see." Ethan took the tablet and frowned. On the screen was hotel security footage from earlier that evening. Sarah and Lily leaving the hotel together in the storm. But before disappearing around the corner, Lily had looked back toward the building one last time. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, the sadness in that little girl's eyes unsettled him far more than the $20 million contract sitting directly in front of him. Nearly an hour later, Ethan still had not signed the contract. The tension inside the conference room had become impossible to ignore. Executives shifted impatiently in their seats, while Victor Kane checked his watch every few minutes with growing irritation. Outside the glass walls of the skyscraper, Chicago glowed beneath freezing rain and sheets of silver fog rolling off Lake Michigan. Normally, Ethan would have already finalized the deal and moved on to the next acquisition without hesitation. But tonight his instincts felt strangely fractured, like 2 versions of himself were fighting quietly beneath the surface. "We are wasting time," Victor finally said. "Every major investor is waiting for confirmation." Ethan remained silent for another moment before standing from his chair. "Take 10 minutes, he said calmly. "I need air." Victor frowned. "Air?" Several executives exchanged confused glances as Ethan walked out of the conference room without another word. The private elevator carried him back down to the lobby where the warmth and luxury suddenly felt suffocating. Wealth had always comforted him before. Tonight it only reminded him how far removed he had become from ordinary people. He loosened his tie slightly and stepped outside into the cold rain. Wind rushed between the buildings hard enough to sting his face. His driver quickly approached with an umbrella, but Ethan waved him away. Across the street, he noticed the small diner he had mentioned earlier to Sarah. Its old neon sign flickered weakly against the storm. Without fully understanding why, Ethan crossed the street alone. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, grilled onions, and heat that had been running too long against winter air. A tired waitress refilled cups while an old country song played quietly through overhead speakers. Ethan scanned the room once before spotting Sarah and Lily sitting in the corner booth near the window. Lily was asleep against her mother's shoulder beneath an oversized coat, while Sarah stirred a cup of coffee slowly, lost in thought. She looked up the moment Ethan approached, surprise flickering across her face. "I did not expect to see you again," she admitted quietly. Ethan glanced toward Lily. "She fell asleep?" Sarah nodded softly. She was trying very hard to stay awake for the pancakes. Ethan sat across from them before he could talk himself out of it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped gently against the diner windows while headlights passed outside in blurred streaks. Finally, Ethan leaned back and studied her carefully. "You answered my question faster than most executives I know," he said. Sarah gave a faint smile. "Maybe because people with less money have to think about consequences more often." That answer unsettled him again. "You really would refuse the money?" he asked. Sarah looked down at Lily sleeping beside her before answering. "When you lose almost everything," she said softly, "you start realizing the only thing nobody can take from you is the kind of person you decide to become." Ethan stared at her quietly. Most people talk differently around billionaires. They tried to sound smarter, more impressive, more useful. Sarah sounded honest. That alone made her dangerous to his worldview. "You speak like someone who had a very different life once," Ethan said carefully. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. For the first time since meeting her, he noticed genuine sadness move across her face. "I did," she answered after a pause. Ethan waited, expecting her to continue. But she did not. Instead, she changed the subject gently. "You asked me a difficult question earlier," she said. "So now I want to ask you one." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "All right." Sarah looked directly into his eyes. "When was the last time you made a decision that helped someone who could never repay you?" The question landed harder than he expected. Ethan opened his mouth to answer immediately, but no words came out. Because the truth was deeply uncomfortable. He could not remember. The silence between them stretched long enough for Ethan to feel uncomfortable in a way he had not experienced in years. He was used to answering questions during interviews, board meetings, and investor calls without hesitation. Confidence had become second nature to him. But Sarah's question lingered in the air with a strange weight he could not escape. "When was the last time you made a decision that helped someone who could never repay you?" Ethan looked away briefly toward the rain sliding down the diner windows. Cars passed outside through the storm while neon lights reflected across wet pavement like broken colors melting into the street. Finally, he exhaled quietly. "I donate millions every year," he answered. Sarah gave a small nod, but did not seem impressed. "That was not my question." Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Most people would have rushed to praise him for his philanthropy. Sarah simply waited for the real answer. Lily shifted slightly in her sleep beside her mother, hugging the stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. Ethan watched the child for a moment before speaking again. "In business," he said slowly, "you learn very quickly that every decision costs someone something. If you hesitate too much, people take advantage of you." Sarah stirred her coffee quietly. "That sounds lonely." The honesty of the statement caught him off guard. Ethan had spent years surrounded by people, yet trusted almost none of them. Assistants managed his schedule. Lawyers protected his assets. Executives competed for his approval. Women dated him because of his status, his money, or the image attached to his name. Even friendships eventually became transactions. Somewhere along the way, he stopped expecting sincerity from anyone. "You think poor people are more honest?" he asked. Sarah shook her head softly. "No. I think struggling just reveals who people already are." Ethan studied her face carefully again. She did not sound bitter. That was what confused him most. Most people in her situation carried visible anger toward the world. Sarah carried exhaustion, sadness, and caution, but not bitterness. "You still have not told me how someone ends up sleeping in shelters while talking like a college professor," Ethan said quietly. Sarah smiled faintly at that. "I used to work in a hospital." Ethan frowned slightly. "As what?" She hesitated for the first time since they met. "Nursing administration," she answered carefully. "A long time ago." Ethan noticed she chose her words very deliberately, like someone protecting parts of her past from being examined too closely. Before he could ask another question, the waitress arrived carrying a fresh plate of pancakes wrapped to go. "For the little one when she wakes up," the older woman said kindly. Sarah thanked her warmly while reaching for her wallet, but the waitress gently stopped her. "Already taken care of." Sarah immediately looked toward Ethan. He raised one hand slightly. "It is just pancakes." But Sarah's expression changed unexpectedly. Not gratitude. Concern. Lily cannot get used to expecting strangers to rescue us, she said softly. Ethan blinked. You would rather she stay hungry? I would rather she learn stability does not come from depending on powerful people, Sarah answered calmly. Ethan leaned back slowly, genuinely stunned now. He had spent years believing money solved everything, because for most people it did. Yet this woman kept speaking about dignity like it mattered more than survival itself. Suddenly Lily stirred awake beside her mother. Her sleepy blue eyes blinked slowly before noticing Ethan sitting across from them. Mom, she whispered quietly. Is that the man from the hotel? Sarah nodded gently. Lily looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking again. You look sad. Ethan froze. Sarah immediately looked embarrassed. Lily, honey, that is not polite. But Ethan barely heard her. Because children usually reacted to his confidence, his expensive suits, or his public image. Nobody had looked at him in years and simply seen sadness. Lily rubbed one eye sleepily and added in the softest voice imaginable. My dad used to look sad like that before he got sick. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, those words hit him harder than any accusation ever could. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell did not know how to respond. Lily's words lingered between them while the soft hum of the diner continued around them unnoticed. You look sad. Such a simple observation should not have affected him so deeply. Yet something about hearing it from a tired little girl sitting in a booth after midnight made the carefully controlled walls inside him feel strangely fragile. Sarah gently brushed Lily's hair back from her forehead. You should not say things like that to strangers, she whispered kindly. But Lily only looked at Ethan again with innocent sincerity. He does, she said quietly. Ethan forced a faint smile, though it felt unfamiliar on his face. Maybe your daughter is more observant than most adults, he admitted. Sarah studied him carefully for a moment as if trying to decide whether he was joking. Before she could answer, Ethan's phone vibrated sharply against the table. Victor Kane. Ethan ignored it immediately. Seconds later, another message appeared from one of his executives. Reporters waiting. Investors angry. Signing delayed. Ethan turned the phone face down without reading the rest. Sarah noticed the expensive watch on his wrist, the constant notifications, the tension hidden beneath his calm expression. You were supposed to be somewhere important, she said softly. I was, Ethan answered. Now I am not sure anymore. Sarah looked genuinely confused by that response. People like Ethan did not pause billion-dollar decisions to sit in diners with homeless strangers. Men like him moved through life with certainty because uncertainty cost money. Yet Ethan suddenly felt more uncertain than he had in years. What happened to Lily's father? He asked carefully. The question changed the atmosphere instantly. Sarah lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup in front of her. For a few seconds, Ethan thought she might refuse to answer altogether. His name was Daniel, she finally said quietly. He got sick 3 years ago. Ethan listened silently. Daniel worked construction most of his life, Sarah continued. Hard worker. Honest. The kind of man who apologized when other people bumped into him. A faint smile touched her face briefly before fading again. When he got diagnosed, our insurance barely covered anything. Every treatment came with another bill. Every medication got more expensive. Ethan felt tension slowly build in his chest. We sold our house first, Sarah said. Then our savings disappeared. Then his truck. Then everything else. Lily listened quietly now, staring down at the stuffed rabbit in her lap. The worst part, Sarah whispered, was watching him feel guilty for being sick. Ethan swallowed hard without fully understanding why. Did the treatment help? He asked carefully. Sarah looked at him for a long moment before answering. Not enough. Silence settled over the booth again. Outside, the storm had softened into light, freezing rain drifting across empty streets. Ethan suddenly remembered one line buried deep inside the acquisition documents upstairs. Kane Biotech planned to increase prices on several life-saving medications after the merger finalized. One of those medications sounded painfully familiar now. Ethan reached for his phone again and quickly opened the digital contract files. His eyes scanned the pharmaceutical list until he found the name. Veridin, a specialty medication used in long-term treatment programs for severe autoimmune diseases. Ethan looked up slowly. Daniel, he said carefully, what illness did he have? Sarah hesitated before answering. A rare immune disorder. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. Was he taking Veridin? Sarah's expression changed immediately. Shock flickered across her face. How do you know that? Ethan did not answer right away. Because suddenly the $20 million deal upstairs no longer felt distant or theoretical. It felt personal. Horribly personal. Sarah stared at him now with growing confusion while Ethan realized something deeply disturbing. The merger he was about to approve would make the exact medication Daniel needed even more expensive for thousands of families already struggling to survive. And for the first time since building his empire, Ethan Caldwell finally saw the human faces hidden beneath his own business decisions. Sarah stared at Ethan across the diner booth while the color slowly drained from his face. The moment she mentioned Daniel's medication, something inside him had visibly shifted. She noticed it immediately. Why do you know the name of that drug? She asked quietly. Ethan looked down at the contract files glowing on his phone screen before locking it again. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed of something connected to his own company. Because my firm is about to help make it more expensive, he admitted softly. The words settled heavily between them. Sarah blinked once, clearly trying to process what he had just said. Lily looked back and forth between them without fully understanding. Ethan leaned back slowly and rubbed one hand across his jaw, exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. The merger upstairs, he explained quietly. Part of the restructuring plan includes raising prices on specialty medications. Sarah said nothing at first. Her expression did not explode with anger like most people would expect. Somehow that made the moment even harder for Ethan. How much? She finally asked. Ethan hesitated. Some medications could increase by 40% over the next year. Sarah lowered her eyes toward the table. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her breathing, like she was forcing herself to remain calm for Lily's sake. Daniel skipped treatments sometimes, she said after several seconds. Not because he wanted to. Because we had to choose between medication and rent. Ethan felt something twist painfully in his chest. There were nights he pretended he was not hungry so Lily could eat more. Sarah's voice stayed steady, but the sadness inside it felt impossible to ignore. He kept apologizing to me for getting sick, like it was somehow his fault. Ethan looked away toward the rain-covered windows because suddenly he could not stand the guilt building inside him. Numbers on spreadsheets had never looked like this before. They had never sounded like exhausted husbands skipping meals or little girls sleeping in shelters. Somewhere along the way, Ethan had trained himself to stop seeing people inside the consequences of his business decisions. But now he could not stop seeing them. I did not know, he said quietly. Sarah looked at him carefully. People at the top almost never do. That sentence hit harder than criticism. Because she was right. Ethan remembered all the presentations he had approved over the years filled with phrases like efficiency optimization and revenue stabilization. Clean corporate language designed to hide ugly realities from people wealthy enough to avoid them. Victor Kane loved language like that. Investors loved it, too. It made suffering sound professional. Ethan suddenly realized how deeply tired he was of hearing it. His phone vibrated again across the table. This time Victor's message was blunt. If you walk away tonight, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly setting the phone aside again. Sarah noticed the tension in his face. You should go back, she said softly. People like you do not stop billion-dollar deals because of conversations in diners. Ethan gave a humorless laugh under his breath. Maybe people like me should. Sarah studied him carefully now, almost like she was trying to decide whether he truly meant that. Before either of them could continue, Lily suddenly coughed hard beside her mother. Sarah immediately touched the little girl's forehead and frowned. She is warm, Sarah whispered worriedly. Lily tried to smile weakly. I am okay, Mom. But Ethan could see the exhaustion in the child's eyes immediately. Sarah quickly gathered their belongings. We need to get back to the shelter before they lock the doors, she said quietly. Ethan glanced outside at the freezing rain still falling across the empty streets. You are taking her there sick? Sarah looked embarrassed by the question. We do not exactly have options. Ethan stood immediately. I can get you a hotel room tonight. Sarah shook her head before he even finished speaking. No. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. She is sick. And I still do not want Lily growing up believing powerful men solve every problem. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, stunned once again by the stubborn dignity inside a woman who had every reason to surrender it. Then Lily quietly reached for her mother's hand and whispered something that made Ethan's chest tighten instantly. Mom, she said softly, I do not feel good. The moment Lily said she did not feel well, every instinct inside Sarah changed instantly. The quiet composure she had carried all evening gave way to visible fear. She pressed her hand gently against Lily's forehead again, and this time even Ethan could feel the heat coming from the little girl's skin. She has been coughing. For 2 days, Sarah admitted softly. I thought it was just the cold weather. Lily leaned weakly against her mother's shoulder, her small face pale beneath the diner lights. Ethan stood up immediately. She needs a doctor. Sarah's expression tightened. Emergency rooms cost money. I will pay for it. That is not the point. Ethan stared at her in disbelief again. Your daughter is sick. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, like someone fighting exhaustion on every level. You do not understand what it feels like when every favor comes with invisible strings attached, she whispered. After a while, survival starts feeling like debt. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, yet he suddenly had no argument strong enough to break through the fear hidden inside that sentence. Before he could respond, Lily coughed harder into her sleeve. Sarah immediately held her close. That was enough. Ethan pulled out his phone and calmly dialed someone. Marcus, he said the second his head of security answered. Bring the car around front now. Sarah shook her head instantly. No. Ethan looked directly at her. You can hate me tomorrow if you want, he said quietly. But tonight your daughter is not sleeping in a shelter. Something in his voice finally made Sarah pause. Not authority. Not wealth. Genuine concern. A few minutes later, a black SUV stopped outside the diner beneath glowing streetlights and freezing rain. Sarah hesitated the entire walk to the vehicle, clutching Lily protectively while Ethan followed beside them. Inside the warm car, Lily fell asleep almost immediately against her mother again. Ethan sat across from them in silence as downtown Chicago drifted past outside the windows. The city looked completely different at 2 in the morning. Less glamorous. More honest somehow. Empty sidewalks. Exhausted workers. Flashing ambulance lights in the distance. Ethan suddenly wondered how many invisible struggles existed behind the thousands of glowing apartment windows surrounding them. The SUV eventually pulled beneath the covered entrance of St. Matthew's Medical Center. The private hospital was one of the most expensive in Chicago. Sarah noticed immediately. We cannot stay here, she said nervously. This place costs. I know what it costs, Ethan interrupted softly. Sarah looked at him with visible discomfort as nurses quickly approached with a wheelchair for Lily. I am not charity, Sarah said quietly before following them inside. Ethan stopped walking for a moment after hearing that. Not because the words offended him, but because he realized how fiercely she was fighting to preserve her identity even while exhausted and terrified. Most people in desperate situations surrendered pride first. Sarah protected hers like it was the only thing she had left. Nearly 40 minutes later, Ethan stood alone near the hospital windows while a doctor reviewed Lily's condition with Sarah privately down the hall. His phone had not stopped vibrating for almost an hour now. Victor Kane, board members, investors, news reporters, one message after another demanding answers. Finally, Ethan answered the call. Victor's voice exploded through the speaker immediately. Where the hell are you? Ethan remained calm. Busy. Do you understand what you are risking right now? Victor snapped. Every investor in that room is furious. Ethan looked through the glass toward Sarah sitting beside Lily's hospital bed down the hallway. Exhausted. Protective. Alone. How much profit are we expecting from the Verdun price increase? Ethan asked quietly. Silence hit the line instantly. That is confidential. Answer the question. Victor exhaled sharply. Roughly 90 million annually after market adjustment. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. $90 million. Built partly on families like Sarah's. On sick husbands apologizing for becoming burdens. On little girls sleeping in shelters after losing everything. Cancel tomorrow's press conference, Ethan said quietly. Victor laughed once in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. I have never been more serious in my life. By sunrise, the story had already spread across Chicago's financial world. Ethan Caldwell had walked away from a $20 million merger less than an hour before the final signing. Investors were furious. Business networks called it reckless. Analysts predicted his company would lose hundreds of millions in market value before the end of the week. Victor Kane spent the entire morning trying to control the damage, appearing on television with carefully rehearsed statements about strategic disagreements and changing market conditions. But Ethan no longer cared about headlines. For the first time in years, he cared more about the consequences behind them. Inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, the atmosphere felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos exploding outside. Lily's fever had finally started coming down after treatment, and she was sleeping comfortably beneath warm blankets while morning sunlight slowly filled the hospital room. Sarah sat quietly beside her daughter, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked exhausted, but for the first time since Ethan met her, she no longer looked afraid. Ethan stood near the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. Sarah looked up carefully. "The nurses told me what happened," she said softly. Ethan gave a tired nod. "Victor thinks I destroyed my own company." Sarah studied him for a moment. "Did you?" Ethan glanced toward Lily sleeping peacefully. "I honestly do not know yet." Sarah looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. Most powerful people never stop long enough to ask whether success is costing someone else their life, she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the wall beside the window. "I spent years believing emotions made people weak," he admitted. "That compassion was just something wealthy people performed publicly while making ugly decisions privately." Sarah gave a faint smile. "And now?" Ethan looked out at the city skyline glowing beneath the pale winter sun. "Now I think maybe people become dangerous the moment they stop seeing human beings behind numbers." Silence settled gently between them. Not awkward silence. Honest silence. The kind that only exists when two people finally stop pretending around each other. A soft voice suddenly broke the quiet. "Mom." Lily was awake now, blinking sleepily beneath the blankets. Sarah immediately moved beside her. "Hey, sweetheart." Lily looked toward Ethan standing near the window. "Did you stay?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded once. Lily smiled faintly. "Good." Something about that tiny word affected him more than every television interview and business award combined. A little girl with nothing still believed his presence mattered. Hours later, Ethan sat alone in his office for the first time since canceling the merger. The city stretched endlessly beneath the glass walls around him, while dozens of unanswered calls filled his phone. His board wanted explanations. Investors demanded damage control. Financial reporters were already calling him unstable. Yet none of it disturbed him as much as it normally would have. Because for the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar inside himself. Peace. Real peace. Not victory. Not power. Something quieter. More human. His assistant eventually entered carrying a folder. "There is something else you should see," she said carefully. Ethan opened the file and froze instantly. Inside were archived medical and emergency records connected to a highway accident nearly 12 years earlier involving his father. According to the report, one of the first hospital staff members who helped stabilize his father during the emergency transfer was a young nursing administrator named Sarah Mitchell. Ethan stared at the page in disbelief. Back then, doctors said his father survived because someone refused to give up during critical delays in the transfer process. Ethan slowly looked up from the file, stunned by the realization settling into place. Years before she ever lost her own husband, before she lost her home, before she stood freezing outside a luxury hotel, trying to protect her daughter's dignity, Sarah Mitchell had already saved someone Ethan loved. And somehow life had brought them back together on the exact night he was about to destroy thousands of families just like hers. Later that evening, Ethan returned quietly to the hospital room, carrying a small paper bag from the diner across the street. Lily immediately smiled when she saw the pancakes. Sarah laughed softly for the first time since he met her, and the sound caught him completely off guard because it felt warm enough to silence every cold thing inside him. Lily looked between them curiously before asking the question neither adult expected. "Why are you helping us?" Ethan stood still for a moment, then looked directly at Sarah before answering honestly. "Because your mother reminded me of the person I was supposed to become."